Of the 47 slaves who watched a master bleed to death from a single touch in 1851, not one ever spoke a word. Because what happened in that Mississippi cotton field wasn't murder, it was a calculated revenge, years in the making, using a weapon no one could see coming. That September morning in 1851, what happened in the cotton field was witnessed by 47 slaves. Yet in the official records of Warren County, Mississippi, not a single testimony was ever recorded. Beneath the merciless sun, what they saw would be whispered about for generations in slave quarters, passed down in hushed warnings and coded spirituals, always ending the same way, with a white man's blood soaking into Mississippi soil and an albino field hand who simply vanished. The plantation ledgers show the death as accidental exsanguination. But a different story is told entirely by the county coroner's notes, sealed for 73 years. The impossible timeline of events, the contradictions in the evidence, the strange marks found carved into the cotton gin that morning, local historians have tried to explain them away. But on the Rutledge Plantation, something far darker than simple murder happened. Something that made 47 people agree, without a single word spoken, to carry a secret to their graves. Before we continue with the story of Caleb and the blood-soaked cotton fields of the Rutledge Plantation, I want to ask you something. This channel exists to bring you the darkest, most unsettling stories from America's hidden past, the ones that were deliberately buried, the ones that challenge everything we think we know about history. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to hear more about the secrets that were never meant to be told, hit that subscribe button right now. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Let's see how many of you are brave enough to admit you're listening to this alone at night. Now, what really happened on that plantation involved careful planning, forbidden knowledge from the Caribbean, and a form of revenge so methodical and calculated that it would take modern forensics decades to even understand how it was accomplished. The thing about Mississippi in 1851 is that everyone kept records. With meticulous precision, plantation owners documented everything, every bale of cotton, every slave purchased, every bushel of corn harvested. It was a society built on manifests and ledgers, on the cold arithmetic of human suffering translated into profit margins. This makes what happened at the Rutledge Plantation even more disturbing, because for 3 weeks in September of that year, the records simply stop. No cotton weights, no discipline logs, no morning roll calls, just blank pages where there should have been careful accounting, as if someone had deliberately erased those weeks from history. Southeast of Vicksburg, where the Yazoo River bends like a broken spine, the Rutledge Plantation sprawled across 1,100 acres of prime delta bottomland. The soil there was so dark and rich, it looked nearly black when wet, the kind of earth that could grow cotton tall as a man's shoulder. Cypress trees lined the river, their knees jutting from the water like ancient sentinels, and in the humid stillness of late summer, the air hung thick enough to chew. In 1847, Nathaniel Rutledge had inherited the property from his father, along with 63 slaves and a reputation for brutal efficiency. He was a lean man with pale eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. And with the cold calculation of someone who viewed human beings as nothing more than machinery that occasionally required maintenance, he ran his plantation. Longer hours than most in Warren County were worked by the slaves on the Rutledge place, and a braided leather whip he had named Salvation was used by the thick-necked Georgian overseer, Virgil Pence, to enforce discipline. On a slight rise overlooking the fields stood the plantation house, a 2-story structure with white columns and a wraparound porch where in the evenings, Rutledge would sit, drinking bourbon and watching the sun set over the cotton that would make him wealthy. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years prior, and their son, a pale, sickly boy named Thomas, was being raised by a house slave named Patience, who had lost her own child the same week Rutledge's wife had passed. Among the 63 souls who labored in those fields, there was one who stood apart in a way that made even the other slaves uncomfortable. In the ledgers, his name was simply Caleb, acquired from a bankrupt planter in Nat Shea in the summer of 1848 for the unusually low price of $300. The reason for the discount was immediately apparent. Caleb was an albino, his skin as pale as any white man's, his hair the color of cotton lint, his eyes a startling pink that seemed to glow in certain lights. He was 24 years old, tall and powerfully built. But that white skin marked him as other, as wrong, as something that existed between worlds. In the slave quarters, They called him Ghost because of his appearance, and because he moved with an eerie silence, appearing and disappearing without sound. Some said his mother had been cursed. Others claimed he was touched by spirits. But the truth, as several of the older slaves knew, was more practical and more terrifying. Before she was captured and brought to Louisiana, Caleb's mother had been a healer in Haiti. She had taught her son everything she knew about plants, about poisons, about the human body, and how it could be manipulated through careful application of knowledge that white doctors dismissed as superstition. Rarely speaking, Caleb himself worked the fields with methodical intensity, never complaining, never slowing, his strange eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. Wide berth was given to him by the other slaves, not because they feared him exactly, but because they recognized something in him that made them deeply uncomfortable, a patience that seemed infinite, a stillness that suggested thoughts moving beneath the surface like currents in deep water. Particularly brutal had been the summer of 1851. Like a physical weight, the heat pressed down, and so thick was the humidity that clothes never fully dried. By August, 3 slaves had collapsed from heat exhaustion, and one, an older man named Marcus, had died face down in the cotton rows, his fingers still gripping the half-filled sack he had been dragging behind him. Before sunset, Rutledge had the body removed and docked each slave's rations by a quarter, claiming Marcus' death had cost him valuable working hours during peak harvest season. In this atmosphere of exhausted desperation, people began noticing changes in their environment, though at the time no one connected these changes to Caleb. The well water began to taste slightly bitter, though not enough to refuse it in the oppressive heat. Suddenly, several of the plantation dogs died, foaming at the mouth, and Pence had blamed it on rabies, though no other animals in the area showed signs of the disease. More numerous than usual seemed insects, particularly flies and mosquitoes, and rashes that the plantation doctor attributed to the heat and poor hygiene were developed by several slaves. In early August, Rutledge himself began complaining of headaches. More irritable than usual he became, quicker to anger, more violent in his punishments. Patients, who brought his meals, noticed he was eating less, that his hands sometimes shook when he lifted his bourbon glass, that he would sit on the porch for hours staring at nothing. She mentioned this to old Isaiah, one of the field hands who had been on the plantation longer than anyone else, and Isaiah had said something that chilled her, "Master's being prepared. Someone's getting him ready." That summer, Caleb had been working the section of field closest to the house, close enough to observe Rutledge's routines, close enough to note when the master took his meals, when he drank his bourbon, when he visited the necessary house behind the main building. That Caleb had been collecting things was later reported by several slaves, certain plants from the woods, bark from specific trees, roots that he would dry in the sun and grind into powder. When asked what he was doing, he would simply say he was making medicine for his joints, which ached from the labor. But Isaiah knew better. His grandmother had been from the islands, and she had taught him to recognize the signs of someone practicing what she had called slow work, the careful, methodical application of natural substances that could alter a person's body chemistry over time, weakening them, making them susceptible to conditions that would appear natural to any doctor who examined them. Isaac remembered his grandmother saying that the best poisons were the ones that killed so slowly the victim never suspected they were being poisoned, that left the body in a state that mimicked natural disease. On the night of September 7th, a field hand named Samuel claimed he had followed Caleb into the woods beyond the cotton fields. From behind a sweet gum tree, he said he had watched as Caleb had knelt beside the creek and carefully washed his hands and forearms with a mixture that smelled sharp and medicinal. Then Caleb had taken a small cloth bundle from his pocket and unwrapped it, revealing dried plant material that he sprinkled into the water while moving his lips in what looked like prayer, but might have been simple counting. Samuel said that when Caleb stood up, he had looked directly at the tree where Samuel was hiding, and even in the darkness, those pale eyes had found him immediately. Caleb had said nothing, had simply stared for a long moment before turning and walking back toward the quarters. And in that moment, Samuel had understood that Caleb knew he had been watched and did not care. This story was told by Samuel to only 3 people, swearing them to secrecy. Within 2 days, all 3 had asked to be reassigned to different work details as far from Caleb as possible. Without asking questions, Pence had obliged, perhaps sensing something in their faces that made him uncomfortable asking for details. None of this was noticed by Nathaniel Rutledge. His attention that September was consumed by cotton prices and yield calculations, though his ability to focus was becoming increasingly impaired. His headaches had intensified, and he had begun experiencing episodes of dizziness and nausea. The plantation doctor, an elderly man named Hiram Kendrick, had examined him twice and could find nothing obviously wrong, though he noted that Rutledge's pulse seemed weak and irregular. A grayish cast had taken over his skin, and his eyes appeared slightly jaundiced. Dr. Kendrick prescribed rest and a reduction in bourbon consumption, advice that Rutledge ignored. What the doctor did not know, what no one knew except Caleb, was that for 3 months, small amounts of carefully prepared plant extracts had been finding their way into Rutledge's food and drink. Not enough to cause immediate illness, but enough to gradually weaken his cardiovascular system, to make his blood vessels more fragile, to alter his blood chemistry in ways that would become catastrophic under the right conditions. From his mother, Caleb had learned that the human body could be manipulated like any other system, that with patience and knowledge, a person could be reduced to a state where a final trigger would cause complete systemic collapse. The plants Caleb used were not exotic or rare. Pokeweed root, which grew abundantly in Mississippi and which in small doses could cause internal bleeding. White snake root, which affected blood coagulation. Foxglove leaves, which disrupted heart rhythm. Water hemlock root, which in minute quantities could damage blood vessels. Each substance was carefully measured, carefully timed, carefully administered through patients, who brought Rutledge's meals, and who had lost her own child to the master's cruelty, and who asked no questions when Caleb gave her tiny vials of clear liquid to add to the bourbon decanter. By early September, Rutledge's body was a biological time bomb. His cardiovascular system was so compromised that any significant stress could trigger catastrophic failure. All that was needed was the right moment, the right trigger. On September 14, a Saturday, a decision was made by Rutledge that would seal his fate, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. He had been drinking since early afternoon, the bourbon making him more irritable than usual, and when Pence brought him the week's cotton weights, he flew into a rage. The numbers were down by nearly 12% from the previous week. Someone was slacking. Someone was stealing from him with their laziness. He demanded to know who was responsible for the shortfall. Pence, who had his own reasons for disliking Caleb, and who perhaps hoped that directing Rutledge's anger elsewhere would spare him from it, suggested that the albino had been working slower than usual. It was a lie. Caleb's output had actually increased, but Pence had seen an opportunity and taken it. This explanation was accepted immediately by Rutledge, perhaps because it confirmed prejudices he already held, perhaps because the bourbon had clouded his judgment, or perhaps because, like Pence, he had felt a vague discomfort around Caleb that he could not quite articulate, but could now justify as suspicion. The order was given. At sunrise on Monday, September 15, Caleb would receive 20 lashes in front of the assembled slaves, and his rations would be cut by half for 2 weeks. Furthermore, he would be assigned to work the section of field closest to the overseer's shack, where Pence could watch him directly. The punishment was excessive, even by the harsh standards of the Rutledge Plantation, and several of the older slaves exchanged worried glances when Pence announced it that evening. They had seen the way Caleb had been moving through the summer, the careful attention he had paid to everything around him, and they recognized the signs of someone preparing for something. That night, no one slept well in the slave quarters. The air felt charged, heavy with something more than humidity. From midnight until dawn, dogs in the surrounding farms barked continuously, though this was likely due to a pack of wild hogs moving through the area. Sounds they could not identify were later reported by several people, though in the darkness and exhaustion, human perception is notoriously unreliable. 3 times from nightmares she could not remember, Patience woke, each time with her heart racing and sweat soaking her thin blanket. In his shack at the edge of the quarters, Caleb spent that night preparing the final element of his plan. From the rafters, he retrieved a small leather pouch that contained a powder he had been preparing for weeks, a concentrated mixture of plants that when inhaled or absorbed through mucous membranes would cause rapid vasodilation and catastrophic blood pressure collapse. The powder was extremely fine, almost like dust, and could be easily concealed and deployed. His mother had taught him how to make it, had warned him it was dangerous even to handle, had told him it should only be used as a last resort because once deployed, The results were irreversible and unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. He also prepared a small glass vial containing a clear liquid, another extract, this one designed to be applied to skin where it would be absorbed transdermally and cause immediate cardiovascular crisis in someone whose system had already been compromised. The combination of months of slow poisoning followed by these two final agents would create a medical emergency so severe and so rapid that death would be inevitable, and the symptoms would mimic a natural hemorrhagic event that doctors of the era would have no way to properly diagnose or treat. With a sky like hammered pewter and air so still that nothing moved, not even the leaves on the trees, Monday morning arrived. When the wake-up bell rang at 5 o'clock, the temperature was already 85 degrees, and by the time the slaves had assembled in front of the big house, the heat was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on shoulders and made breathing laborious. At 6 o'clock sharp, Rutledge emerged onto his porch, dressed in a white linen suit despite the early hour. He carried his bourbon glass, even though it was barely dawn, and his eyes were bloodshot from the previous night's drinking. His hands shook slightly as he set the glass down on the porch railing, and his skin had a grayish undertone that suggested his body was already in distress. Beside him stood Pence, the whip called Salvation coiled in his thick hands. In rough rows facing the porch stood the 63 slaves, their faces carefully blank, their eyes focused on nothing in particular. This was survival. Show no emotion. Reveal no thoughts. Become invisible even while standing in full view. Bring out the albino, Rutledge said, his voice carrying clearly in the dead air, though it sounded strained, as if speaking required effort. Slowly, Caleb emerged from the quarters, walking, each step measured and deliberate. He was shirtless, his pale torso almost luminous in the growing light, and on his arms were marks, deliberate scars that he had given himself over the years, each one representing a person he had lost to slavery's cruelty, each one a reminder of why he was doing what he was doing. His pink eyes were fixed on Rutledge with an intensity that made several slaves look away. With purpose he moved, like someone approaching the culmination of long planning. He stopped 10 feet from the porch and stood perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing slow and regular. In his right hand, concealed against his palm, was the small leather pouch containing the powder. In his left hand, hidden against his wrist, was the tiny glass vial. This moment he had practiced in his mind 1,000 times, had planned every movement, had calculated every risk. With the whip, Pence moved toward him, but something made the overseer pause. Later, he would tell the county sheriff that he had felt uneasy, that something about Caleb's stillness had been unnerving, though he could not articulate why. But Rutledge was watching, and pride pushed Pence forward. "Strip him to the waist and tie him to the post," Rutledge ordered, though Caleb was already shirtless. Cautiously, 2 slaves, men who had known Caleb for 3 years but had never felt comfortable around him, approached. They took his arms to lead him to the whipping post, a thick timber sunk deep into the earth specifically for this purpose. But as they grasped his arms, Caleb suddenly twisted, breaking their grip with surprising strength. And before anyone could react, he had moved forward, closing the distance to Rutledge in 3 quick steps. "You will not touch me," Caleb said, his voice low, but carrying clearly. "Not with that whip. Not ever again." Rutledge's face went pale, then flushed red with rage. He descended the porch steps, moving toward Caleb with his fists clenched, his judgment impaired by bourbon and mounting fury. "You dare refuse me? You dare speak to me like that?" This was exactly what Caleb had been waiting for. Rutledge close enough to touch, his blood pressure already elevated by anger, his compromised cardiovascular system pushed to its limits by rage and alcohol. As Rutledge reached for him, Caleb made 2 movements so quick that most witnesses would later disagree on exactly what they had seen. First, he crushed the leather pouch in his right hand, releasing the fine powder directly into Rutledge's face. Reflexively, the master inhaled, gasping in shock and anger, drawing the powder deep into his lungs where it would be rapidly absorbed into his bloodstream. Second, as Rutledge staggered back, coughing and sputtering, Caleb's left hand shot out and made contact with Rutledge's chest just above his heart. The touch lasted less than a second, but it was long enough for the liquid from the broken vial, which Caleb had crushed against his own palm, to transfer to Rutledge's skin through his thin linen shirt. The effect was not instantaneous, but it was rapid. The powder inhaled into Rutledge's lungs caused immediate severe vasodilation, dropping his blood pressure catastrophically. The liquid absorbed through his chest caused his already compromised heart to begin beating irregularly, too fast and then too slow, unable to maintain adequate circulation. And his blood vessels, weakened by months of slow poisoning, began to rupture internally. Rutledge froze. His hands went to his chest, clutching at the place where Caleb had touched him. His eyes widened with confusion, and the first edge of terror, and then, with everyone watching, a red stain began to spread across the white linen of his shirt, directly where Caleb had touched him. But there was no external wound. What was happening was internal hemorrhaging so severe that blood was being forced through the pores of his skin, through his sweat glands, seeping out through intact skin in a way that would have been medically impossible without the specific combination of substances Caleb had administered over months. From Rutledge's nose, from his ears, from the corners of his eyes, blood began running. His mouth filled with blood as internal bleeding in his lungs made him cough up dark, thick streams of it. Backward, Rutledge staggered, his hands clutching at his chest, his eyes wide with confusion and dawning horror. He tried to speak, but from his mouth instead of words came blood, thick and dark, running over his chin and down his neck. He looked at Caleb with an expression that mixed incomprehension with terror, and Caleb looked back with eyes that held something that might have been satisfaction, might have been vindication, might have been simple acknowledgement that a long-planned action had finally been executed. "Walk to the field," Caleb said quietly, his voice steady. "Walk to the center of your cotton where you have built your wealth on our bodies. Walk there and know what you have done." And remarkably, impossibly, Rutledge turned and began walking toward the cotton fields. Medical science would later suggest that he was in shock, that his brain was starved of oxygen, that he was acting on some final autonomic impulse. But in that moment, it looked as if he was obeying Caleb's command, as if the albino slave had somehow taken control of the dying man's final moments. Stiff, mechanical were Rutledge's movements, and blood continued to flow from his chest, from his mouth, from his nose and ears, soaking his white suit until it was entirely red. In the dust, he left a trail of crimson drops, each one marking his path, each one soaking into the earth he had worked slaves to exhaustion to cultivate. Paralyzed, Pence stood, his mouth working soundlessly. In silence, the assembled slaves watched, and though many of them hated Rutledge with an intensity that had sustained them through years of brutality, what they saw in that moment was something beyond simple murder. It was execution, methodical and planned, carried out by someone who had spent months preparing, who had used knowledge most of them did not possess, who had turned the master's own body into a weapon against itself. The edge of the cotton field was reached by Rutledge, and he pushed between the rows, the tall plants swallowing him from view. But by the swaying of the cotton tops, by the wet sounds that carried across the still morning air, by the crows that suddenly erupted from the field in a black cloud, calling their alarm to the indifferent sky, the slaves could track his progress. Motionless, Caleb stood, watching Rutledge disappear into the cotton. At his sides, his hands hung, stained red from the broken vial and from where Rutledge's blood had splattered onto him. Controlled and even was his breathing, and no emotion at all showed on his face. For 3 years he had planned this moment, from the day he had been purchased and had recognized in Rutledge the same cruelty he had seen in his previous owners, the same casual violence, the same absolute conviction that human beings could be owned and used and discarded. 10 minutes passed, 15. The sun cleared the horizon, turning the sky from gray to pale blue, and with an intensity that felt personal, vindictive, the heat built. No one moved. No one spoke. They waited, though for what, none of them could have said with certainty. They were waiting to see if Rutledge would emerge from the field. They were waiting to see what Caleb would do next. They were waiting for reality to reassert itself and make sense of what they had witnessed. Finally, the swaying cotton fell still. The wet sounds ceased. A silence descended that felt absolute, as if the world had stopped breathing. To face the assembled slaves, Caleb turned. From face to face, his pale eyes moved, looking at each of them in turn, and then he spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. He died from his own cruelty, from years of bad living, bad drinking, bad choices. His body gave out because he drove it as hard as he drove us. The doctor will find nothing that points to anything except natural causes. A hemorrhagic event, a stroke, a heart failure, something his body was always going to do eventually. I simply made sure it happened today in front of all of you so you would know that monsters are not invincible. They are just men, and men can die. Then Caleb walked to the quarters, gathered his few possessions, and disappeared into the woods before Pence recovered enough presence of mind to try to stop him. By the time the overseer organized any response, Caleb was gone, and he would never be found despite extensive searches.